Hello everyone, thank you for joining me for another video where we are talking about what we read in November. I'm your host Voodoo Pickles and thank you so much for taking the time to hang out with me. Today we're going to be talking about the books that I read in November, which November was a slow reading month for me. I had my car breaking down, I had increased hours at work, and it was my birthday month, so I was sitting around watching stuff when I was not at work and just kind of hanging out with family. I did watch all the episodes of The Glory on Netflix for my birthday weekend, so that was fun. That was fun. It was like a 20-hour movie. It was great. But thank you so much for hanging out with me. The first book that we read this month was The Dark Apprentice. This is the second book in the Jedi Academy trilogy. It was written by Kevin Anderson, and we read this physically, and it was about 354 pages. And this book takes place about 6 months after the events that happened in the first book. And in the first book we were learning about Luke setting up the Jedi Academy and Leia having to deal with all of the political mess that was left after while trying to start up a new republic. And Han had his whole adventure on Kessel where he brought back Kip, and it's a pretty crazy story, and it was really enjoyable. And this one takes place 6 months after that. So in the first couple of chapters, we are hit right in the feels. It was ridiculous. This book it was very heavy with how crazy it went, and it was so good. So we're still following Leia and how she's trying to navigate this political landscape that is in the New Republic, while also trying to put out fires for things that happen within the first couple of chapters. And I'm not going to go into any spoilers, but it was crazy. And so we're following her through all of this. Han, in the first book, their relationship with Leia and Han, you're just like, "Aw, I get it." And you're like you're asking Leia, why are you being so mean to him? Why? He's just nothing. He's just a sweetheart. And then in the second book, you realize, no, she acted like that for a reason. How she acted in the first book with her relationship with Han makes perfect sense. I was so annoyed with Han, and I had to stop reading every now and then. I'm like, this son of a bitch. And I had to go find my husband wherever he was at in the house and be like, listen to what just happened in the book. I need to tell you what happened. And so I learned a lot more about their relationship, and I'm just like, okay, I get this. I understand this a lot more. And we're also following Luke, who is at his new Jedi Academy. He set up this whole area, and there's, I think, 6 students there at the beginning, and we still have people that are going to be coming in, new characters that we're being introduced to, and how he's building this academy and how his students are reacting to his teachings. And it threw a red herring at me for what I thought was going to happen with the students. And I was like, no. I know what's going to happen. I'm not stupid. I can connect dots. And then it's like, all right, I'm connecting the dots here. And then I was like, oh, I didn't think the dots were going to connect this way, but okay. Interesting. And then it circles something back around, and then I'm like, ha 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 ha. I figured it out, and the way that we're told what goes on through that, and finding out what happens with his students is only the little bit of getting introduced to this academy and what goes on. And after we're introduced to what happens there, we have Kui, who we met in the first book, who was a scientist for the Empire, mostly because she was trained to be from a young age. And she is with General Wedge, and they're just adorable together. They're so adorable together. And I'm like, this poor thing deserves everything. Like, and then she gets attacked for a very specific reason that ties to all of this stuff. We're getting all of these little bits and pieces from the story, and they're all coming into this whole web of what's going on in the story. And we're left with the book with a whole bunch of questions unanswered. There's, oh, okay, no spoilers. There's, yeah, it's so good. The story comes together, and you're just right before you can get any resolution to just about anything that is happening. The book ends and just leaves us hanging there. And like, it's so good. It took me a while to finish this book, mostly because it was very heavy. It dealt with like a lot of things. It hit me in the feels in weird different ways that books don't usually do. But because I'm so invested in these characters from the first book and the whole like lore of it, it hit me more. And there was a lot of times where I had to put the book down and I'm like, I'm so angry or I'm so upset. I need to woosah. So it took me a while to read it, but it was so good. And I can't wait to finish the trilogy. We have one more book left in the trilogy, and I'm going to start to read that hopefully this month, and I can't wait to see how it's going to be. I'm kind of hesitant to pick it up, but I'm excited to pick it up. I really want to know what happens, but I am also very wary of how this is gonna go. But I rated this a 4.5 out of 5. I really enjoyed it. Like I said, it was very heavy. It was very just but it was good. It was good. I can't wait to finish the whole rest of the trilogy. And the second book that we read this month was Sugar Queen. Sugar Queen is a book that I've read, I want to say like 5 times before. I've read this pretty regularly. This is a comfort book for me. This is when on the years that I am reading around winter time when it's starting to snow or anything, I try and read Sugar Queen. Sugar Queen was written by Sarah Addison Ellen, and I read this physically, and it was 341 pages. And this book takes place in North Carolina. And it centers around this rich family named the Serenis, and they have built a ski town. Like the patriarch of the family, who had passed away years before, built this whole ski resort within this small little mountain town that was not doing well money-wise before he showed up. And he showed up, he built this resort, he was just like became the like most important man in this town. And we are following the relationship between his daughter Josie and his wife Margaret, and how they have a very not great relationship. I'm trying to think of the correct words, but it's a very tense relationship. It's a very resentful relationship, and Josie gets to figure out why that happens, and as well as we do throughout that whole story. And it centers around them, and we're introduced to some other characters as well. We have Della Lee, she's a waitress in a diner. She goes to a lot of bars. She's very outspoken. She's very just kind of in your face. And she meets Josie, and Josie meets her, and their relationship, they become friends. And it's just their story of how Josie is learning about the town around her, where she grew up. She was born and raised in this town, and now she's learning a whole new aspect of this town, learning more about her family and the relationship between her mother and her father, and how that affects how she sees the world. And it's very comforting to me. And it's also a little supernatural-ish, which is very nice. The first time I read this book, that took me for a loop, because I didn't realize it was going to be supernatural-ish, but I really appreciate how it was very subtly done. And we have murder in there, and it's a nice read. It's a very comforting read for me, and I really enjoy it. So I rated this a 4.5 out of 5. It'll always be one of my favorite books. It came to me in one of those times where I really needed a book like this, and it is actually the first book that I ever bought overseas and with my own money for myself. like, it's all those things all at once, and it's one of my favorites. And like I said, 4.5 out of 5. I enjoy it. I will probably continue to read it at least once a year. And the third book that we read this month was Frankenstein, and this was written by Mary Shelley, and I did read the 1818 edition, and I read this digitally through my library, and it was about 202 pages. And if you do not know the story of Frankenstein, I'm going to try not to do so much spoilers, but it was written in 1818, and there's so many movies and so many things on it. And the Frankenstein story is one of my favorite stories. Last month I read Dracula stories. I read a lot of vampire stories, and just because Halloween was there, I started Frankenstein towards the end of October. I just didn't finish it until November, so it got put in November. But the Frankenstein story is one of my favorite stories. This story is being told to us by a captain of a ship who is off in the Arctic Circle trying to do some sciencey science stuff, and he meets Victor Frankenstein, who is chasing somebody, and Victor Frankenstein is sick, he is ill, and he is telling this man his backstory, like his whole history, and that he created a creature that repulsed him so much that he abandoned the creature. And then in the story, we're told from Victor Frankenstein that the creature came back to him years later and told him what he went through after Victor Frankenstein abandoned him, and what he went through after that, and how his distrust and hate for humankind kind of grew and increased, and then how he is, I don't think blackmailing is the right word, but threatening Victor Frankenstein to make him a person to be with him. He wants a mate. He wants somebody who can be in isolation with him that won't run away from him. And Victor decides to, and then decides to not. And the rest of the story is how the creature gets his revenge on Victor Frankenstein, and it leads him on this whole wild goose chase all the way to where the captain found him currently in the Arctic Circle, just about dead. And the captain is writing all of this down in letters to his sister who lives in London. And we get little breaks in between the storytelling of this captain's journal pieces and his letters that he writes to his sister, and it's a good story. I really enjoy it. It is a really good story, and this is definitely one of the books that I think everybody should read. I really enjoyed it. I really want to have it physically, which I was surprised I don't own this physically, but it is free to read mostly throughout almost all the libraries. I think there's even an audiobook for free on YouTube as well. But I rated this a 4.25 out of 5. It's one of my favorite stories. I enjoy it. And the fourth book we read this month was All the Beautiful Sinners. This was written by Stephen Graham Jones, and I read this digitally through my library, and it was approximately 283 pages. And this book is a trip. It's written very odd, but the way it is written makes sense within the context of the story, but it's really hard to follow if you're not sitting there reading it quickly. I took breaks between reading it because I was reading this and Frankenstein and Sugar Queen, kind of all switching back and forth through those, and so you would lose the flow of it a little bit. So I suggest reading this book all at once. It's not a terribly long book, and this book follows Jim Doe, who is an indigenous man in Texas who works as a sheriff's deputy in this town. And when he was younger, he lost his sister in a tornado. Not in the tornado. She was kidnapped right after the tornado left the town. It hit, there was caused devastation, and it was gone, and she was kidnapped right at that point afterwards. And so he's been trying to find his sister and think of where she's at, which kind of caused him to go into law enforcement. And while he's on patrol, I think it's too spoilery because it happens on right up front, like in the first few pages, the sheriff of his town is killed. And so he's trying to find the person who killed the sheriff. And it takes him on this chase throughout all of these states in the United States. It goes through like Texas, he goes to Oklahoma, he goes all the way north to, I think, North or South Dakota. He just calls them the Dakotas. And he's chasing this man who he feels, or he knows, kills the sheriff of his town. And there's a family. It's really hard to explain what this story is without having spoilers, but that's how it starts off. So he goes on through this, and he meets more indigenous people throughout the story, and one older man who is the same indigenous person no matter what state he is in. And I'm like, as somebody who is indigenous and grew up on a reservation and then left the reservation, I'm like, I swear I've seen this older man around. And he's always talking to me, asking me who my clan is. And so it makes a lot of sense within this context. And we end up finding there's a family that has very specific reasons for what they're doing. And it's a roller coaster of what is going on. And the way that the POV shifts in chapters, and it goes through. The chapters are sometimes within the current year, and then sometimes they flash back. And it does tell you what year the chapter is taking place in at the beginning of the chapter, but you don't really get to know who the POV of the chapter is until they say in dialogue that it's somebody, or you get to figure out the voices of the different characters, and you just kind of have to put it together yourself. The book does not hold your hand to help you come to the conclusions of what is going on in it, but it is so good. Like, once you get past the halfway point, you get enough information that you're like, okay, I can ride the rest of this book. It's a thriller book, so you're like, I can do this. Like, it's just gonna go. And then towards the end, it throws a curveball at you, and you're like, wait, what? And then I had to go back like a chapter or two and be like, was this in here before? Because you're acting like it was in here before. Was it in here before? Some cases, yes, it was in there before, and I just didn't catch it or didn't retain in my head. And other cases, I'm like, no, it wasn't in there. This is brand new information. And when the last chapter happened, I didn't realize that was going to be the last chapter until it said epilogue. And then I was like, oh, okay, I have questions. And the epilogue does a nice job of wrapping it up. And if you go back and you look, I had to go back and look at a couple of chapters and be like, oh, now I get it. Now I get it. Now I understand. So it is hard to follow if you're not going to read the story like completely through very quickly. If you take breaks like I do, or if you're reading multiple books like I do as well, then it is harder to keep track of. But it's still a very good story. I rated this a 3.5 out of 5. I enjoyed it. But like I said, it was hard to keep track of a lot of things because it wasn't my sole focus at the time. And the fifth book that we read this month is I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. This is a collection of short stories written by Harlan Ellison. I read this digitally through my library, and it was about 246 pages. And this one contains 7 short stories. And the short stories have I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, which is the title as well. Big Sam Was My Friend, Eyes of Dust, World of the Myth, Lonely Egg, Delusion for a Dragon Slayer, and Pretty Maggie Money Eyes. So these are very different short stories, and after each short story that is put in here, we get it spans anywhere from a paragraph to about 2 pages worth of Harlan Ellison's just thoughts on what he was doing when he wrote these stories. Like why he wrote them, why he felt compelled to write them, what was going on in his life, and just kind of explaining where this story came from, which was very interesting to read about about his thoughts on the stories. And like I said, the first one is I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, which is a post-apocalyptic story. I'm not going to talk about what's contained in the stories as much because they are short stories and it would be very spoilery. But I have to say that out of all the stories, Big Sam Was My Friend, which is in space, Eyes of Dust, which is also, well, not in space, it's just on a different world. World of Myth was on a different planet. Talks about going through space. Lonely Ache seemed very like our timeline, Earth type thing. Delusion for a Dragon Slayer starts off on our planet and then goes to a different place. Pretty Maggie Money Eyes takes place in Vegas. But Big Sam Was My Friend, Eyes of Dust, and Pretty Maggie Money Eyes were my favorites out of them. I was really happy that I did finish I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. I've heard a lot about this story and I've seen a lot of different videos talking about it, so I knew what was going into the story, but actually having read it myself, I feel like I'm like, okay, I understand more of what people are talking about now. I get it. I get it. And some parts of it cracked me up, and there was some parts of that story like I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, Lonely Ache, and Delusion for a Dragon Slayer. Those three stories had me rolling my eyes in very specific places for very specific reasons, which I will talk about when I talk about the book as a whole. But the other stories were some of my favorites, and I really enjoyed the more sci-fi type stories that he was writing. And reading the little exposition at the end of those of why he was writing those stories, where he was at mentally and everything, I'm like, oh, I get it. That puts a different spin on the stories and I understand them better now. But I gave this a 3.75 out of 5. And those were the 5 books that I read this month. And like I said, it was a slower reading month. December is looking to be pretty busy at work, but hopefully I'll have more time after work to read more like actual books, and if not, then I'll probably be reading a lot of audiobooks for December. But what did you guys read for November? I hope you guys read some amazing books, consumed some amazing stories, and thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. I hope you guys have an amazing day, night, afternoon, whatever it is where you are. If you want to look for any of these books, I'll leave a link down below for where you can buy them from your local bookstore, where you can buy used books through thrift books, or if you're in the United States, where you can find your local library and get them physically or digitally or through an audio through, like I use the Libby app through my library. And there's also going to be a link for all of my socials. Don't forget to do all the YouTube things, like, subscribe, all of that. And I'll hopefully talk to you guys very soon. Bye.